Hello and welcome to Lesson 13 in this Chess Beginner to Winner series, in which we take you from absolute chess beginner to winning your first chess tournament games and beyond. All right, today we are going to talk about pawn weaknesses. For all the beginners out there that are not sure what to do with their pawns, or sometimes you may just neglect your pawns and think that pawns are made for sacrificing and giving up to attack with. One thing to remember is that every pawn could potentially promote to a queen. I would recommend not giving your pawns away too freely, because you never know in the end game when a single pawn could be important, especially if you can promote it to a queen. All right. Well, in this position here, the first thing I'm going to discuss, and I mentioned it before, is pawn islands. So a pawn island is a grouping of pawns that are connected. So one island for white would be this group of pawns here from A3 to B2 to C3 to D4. So all these pawns are connected and they kind of work to protect each other. So the B pawn protects the A pawn and the C pawn, and the C pawn protects the D pawn. So they form a chain. So this pawn chain is one island, and this pawn chain here is another island from H2 up here to F4. And they do a good job of protecting each other. The weakest link in a pawn chain would be the base of the chain here. So we see this rook is putting pressure on this base pawn in the pawn chain. And the reason it's weak, or the weakest link, is because there are no pawns back behind it that can protect it. Whereas we see these other pawns here are protected by the pawn behind it. So this B pawn is protecting A3 and C3, and C3 protects D4. So you get the point. The base of the chain is the weak link in the pawn chain, and that's usually a good area to attack. And if you can't attack the base of the chain successfully, then the top of the chain might be another area that you could try and attack. The only way black could do that is if he could somehow push this pawn here on C6 up, but of course the rook is doing a good job guarding that. Okay, so pawn islands. You want to avoid having too many pawn islands, because the pawns work together, work better together when they're in a chain like this, protecting each other side by side. And we see white only has 2 pawn islands, but black has 1, 2, 3, 4. So double the number of pawn islands, and we can see many pawn weaknesses in this position. So we have an isolated pawn here. An isolated pawn is a weakness because that pawn is just stuck out all by itself with no pawn beside it to help back it up. And it can become a target for attack. This rook here could swing over and try and attack this isolated pawn. But the rook could try and protect that. But the problem with having so many pawn islands, it's hard to cover everything. It can cause too many weaknesses for you to be able to protect them all. So another weakness when it comes to pawns is doubled pawns like this. So here we have 2 pawns, and why is that a weakness? These are doubled and isolated. So at least if they had a pawn beside them, you could try and, I don't know, maybe push one of the pawns, then push the other. But when they're isolated and doubled like this, the pawn in front slows down the pawn behind it. They kind of get in each other's way, and just leave more opportunities for your opponent to attack them, especially if something gets in front of the pawns and just locks them in place, and then they can become a target. Especially if there were more pieces on the board, knights and bishops, then it would be even more difficult to defend these doubled, isolated pawns here. All right, and another pawn weakness is a backwards pawn. So we have a pair of pawns here, but one of them is backwards here, and the problem with that is that, once again, there are no pawns back here to defend this backward pawn, and it creates a nice outpost square, which I'll probably do a lesson on that in the future and discuss more about outposts. But basically, an outpost square is some place where a pawn has pushed forward, or there are no pawns that can chase a piece away from jumping into this outpost square on e5. So you have this backward pawn here that the rooks are putting pressure on, and there's this pawn here to the right of this pawn that is pushed forward, leaving this one backward and weak. And so right away here, white could, if it's white's turn to move, he could just pick off this pawn here and grab material. Pick off the pawn. Black has to make a decision if he would recapture. Another technique could be something like this, where you attack that pawn, and if there's a recapture, well, then you could capture this rook here. But that would allow this rook to swoop in here and pick off this pawn and then go after these. And why give your opponent counterplay like that? If you can just stop the counterplay by preventing this rook from jumping into this outpost square. And this would be a more dangerous outpost square if black didn't have to worry about all these weak pawns, and if there was a pawn pushed up here to protect the rook. An outpost square's the best piece to put in there usually, or many times, is a knight, because the knight can block the pawn from moving forward, and from the outpost square it can jump into the enemy's position. But if we look here, it looks like the computer recommends rook to a5. So that is possible. White could play b4 here to push this weak backward pawn up and block the scope of this rook. But with this move, white immediately attacks this pawn. And then the computer recommends either rook to b7 or ignoring that, losing a pawn and just pushing this pawn to h5. So let's say there's a defense here. Well, now it looks like the king should jump up here and join in the action. Another possibility is to move up here with the rook to a6 and attack this front pawn in these doubled up pawns here. So you could try that. We could take a look at that move. Here, black is just starting to lose material. If he tries to go up here and protect this pawn, well, you could just capture this pawn. If he pushes forward, then your pawn could capture. So, you begin to see that it is very unwise to create too many pawn islands and pawn weaknesses, especially doubled pawns, doubled isolated pawns like these, and lone isolated pawns. So just remember that when you're making exchanges, try to avoid moves that break up your pawn structure. So let me set up a position here, or I'll just play through a few moves in a game. So let's say we have a normal game, e4, e5, knight to f3, attacking the pawn. Then we go here, and right away we could attack this knight. And if we have something like this, now white, if he wanted to, could capture this knight. And now we see that there are two options to capture, recapture the bishop with the d pawn or the b pawn. And the better move, according to the computer, is capturing this way. And normally you want to capture towards the center of the board. But by capturing away in this manner, you keep your pawns all together in one pawn island. So black would just have two pawn islands, one here and one over here. And so if black would have instead captured the other way, with the b pawn towards the center, well, now this gives him an isolated pawn over here on the a file that can be a long-term weakness. And the computer recommends that white continue with either castling or d4. But if we go with d4 and then capture, and now queen captures, let's see. Now we're looking at 2 pawn islands for white, and black already has 3 different pawn islands here, and he has these doubled pawns as well. And so in this position, it's black's turn to move. He could attempt to try and break up the pawn island, or excuse me, the doubled pawns, and get rid of his doubled pawns. So, if he would try something like this, well, it looks like white's best move would be to ignore this and just develop either castle kingside, or bring his bishop out, or even knight to c3. But white probably should not play this, because then you could have c captures d5, and now the pawns have been undoubled here. So white would have inadvertently kind of helped black get rid of one of his weaknesses of doubled pawns here. He still has this isolated pawn here, which could be an endgame weakness. But you get the idea. If we go back to the beginning here, and you have an option to capture and keep your pawns together, or capture the other way, even though in general you want to capture with your pawns towards the center, just be mindful that that could leave a long-term weakness with this isolated pawn, and you could end up with more pawn islands. Whereas, if you capture with the d pawn, all your pawns are together and they can push forward and work in unison. And you could probably try and get rid of this doubled pawn as you push your pawns forward. All right. Well, as a review, I'll show you one more time all these different pawn structures that you want to try and avoid, pawn weaknesses that you don't want to deal with in the end game. So let's take a quick look at those. So you want to avoid the isolated pawn all by itself. And then you want to avoid doubled pawns, and especially doubled isolated pawns. And even worse would be tripled pawns, because they get in each other's way. They can't really help each other. The only good point, I guess I could say, with these pawns is that they do cover a lot of squares down this D file. They guard a lot of squares. So that could be one benefit of doubled or tripled pawns. But in general, you want to avoid these isolated pawns, doubled, tripled pawns. Avoid all of that. Try not to make too many pawn islands. And even if you have doubled pawns, but they're not isolated, even that is a little bit of a weakness, because the pawn in front is slowing down the movement of the pawn behind it, especially if you had a bishop there, and if we had other pieces or other pawns here blocking the path of the bishop, it can slow down your development. So anyway, a pair of doubled pawns, they're not as weak if there's another pawn beside them, because you could try, I don't know, something like this, where you push forward here, and now your opponent does not want to help you break these pawns forward, or excuse me, if your opponent would capture and then you recapture, then your opponent just helps you get rid of the doubled pawns. So instead, it would be better, if the opponent is able to do so, especially if he had maybe a pawn here, to just push forward and gain space and leave your opponent stuck with these doubled pawns. So that is one strategy. Now, also, you want to avoid, let's say this pawn wasn't here, you want to avoid backward pawns as well, because if we remove this pawn and are able to put a knight in here, we have a good outpost for this knight, which jumps into the enemy position. There are no pawns here on the F or D files that are able to chase this knight away. The only way to get rid of this knight is to attack it with a piece. So, avoid isolated pawns, doubled and tripled pawns, backward pawns. Many times a backward pawn could just look like, I don't know, something like this. Let me get rid of these other pawns here for a minute. And there's a technique that you can use also. Let's say their pawns are like this. This one is backward. You could lock that backward pawn in place by going here. And let's say, if their king is here, maybe you could, and if the king is up here, you could try something like this maybe. And especially if these pawns, there were no pawns here. Now you have the option with two different outpost squares to jump the knight up here, or even here, although a knight on the rim can be dim, so watch out. The knight has less scope on the edge of the board, but, maybe something like this. Anyway, so just remember, when it comes to pawn weaknesses, avoid creating too many pawn islands, avoid isolated pawns, backward pawns, doubled pawns, and hopefully by avoiding those pawn weaknesses, you will have a little more success in your chess games and not have to babysit all those pawn weaknesses, and you can avoid creating them in the first place. All right, everybody. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video on pawn weaknesses, which is lesson 13 in this Chess Beginner to Winner series, where we try and take you from absolute chess beginner to winning your first tournament games and beyond. And if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and feel free to leave comments or suggestions, and also any requests if there are some type of instructional chess topics that you really want to see, then I will try and work on those in the future. Thank you, everyone, and have a super chess day.